well, and for many parts still is a ghetto, right? So what exactly do we mean? And the 70s, there are many manifestations and expressions of them. This is the one of, I think, the most insightful. The idea that we are living in a racialized and divided world. And I think even more compelling now than ever. So the issue, of course, is how to get beyond this. In the framing of the conference is there are these global historical fault lines, and just to come back, I mean, so we're talking about complex and complicated revisitings of old world historical context. So race, I don't know, what shall we put it at least half a millennium? This is a 500-year-old idea, which is a biological absurdity. All right, it should be suggested as such, but it remains an almost intractable sociological, political, cultural fact. So how do we get to deal with these contradictions? I think the urgency for us right now is to move beyond racism. How do we do that? So clearly, a key part of this is an ideological project. Right? I mean, and maybe that's the foundation. So in rethinking about this, I mean, my generation, we grew up in South Africa, where we were privy to one rupture, right, within this thinking that didn't work out the way we had intended, but there's fascinating reformulations of this happening in this generation, represented by Brian and these students at this point in time. So, having said this idea of capitalism or racial capitalism, and I'm framing the conference with Fanac, the idea was to move towards what we think about as a new humanity or shared learning. So, for the purposes of today, let's hold on to this idea that race, or the ideology of racism, because that's essentially what it is actually the denial of a shared human existence. Right? I mean, that is Genesis. And within the theme of the conference is this notion that we have to, in some ways, return to the source. In other words, where do these ideas come from, in order to understand how we're going to fight them. Now, and of course, then build the base. So, I was motivated when I went back again to South Africa. There's some very important projects that's happening about the failure of the South African transition, all right, that has revealed certain issues. So I had this idea of racial capitalism. Now, very quickly in South Africa, and many people, I mean, when I grew up, we call it racial capitalism, or might be one that I call it apartheid capitalism. But I want to recover the idea that perhaps, and I think there's a very exciting movement right now in South Africa that's maybe perhaps rebranding it as, quite correctly, its historical foundations as colonial capitalism. Right? So we need to think of this is the all right, so I want to juxtapose that to, I think, what Michael was talking about in terms of what we might think about as finance capital, right? The monopoly finance. So this is the capitalism that is rooted in the colonial project, which, again, geographically is a European project. So world historically, the European project is a racist one. All right, now we can, again, think through ideologically. Again, we have some formal sociological theorists that take us through the origins of capitalism, in other words, the idea of the distinction between capital and labor, but then we have philosophies that contradict that in some way. Right? There are many, if you want to, non-European philosophers, particularly Caribbean thinkers, Cedric Robinson and so forth, that show that within the slavery, you have to expect the embodiment of capital and labor in one, right? There's not an analytical distinction between the two. So the question is not so much what does Marx have to say about slavery, what does slavery have to say about Marxism? So there's some problematics we have to revisit these fundamental categorizations. Now, where does one begin with this sort of idea of revisiting these, if you want to, false boundaries or categorical distinctions? So, of course, it's a geographic issue. I want to suggest that I'm convinced that in South Africa right now, and particularly the poor people's movements, the movements against the evictions of housing, there's a particular critique of capitalism, all right, as an anti-racist critique that's emerging that has, and is beginning to destabilize very fundamentally the project to reconstruct South Africa, all right, or a non-racial South Africa. So that's where, when I go back, I see a lot of evidence for this. And I was part of an earlier project where we worked with people based on their lived experiences, and we were producing little pamphlets like this about some of the ideas, sort of workers type of pamphlets. So let me perhaps coherently argue that some of you were part of the discussion earlier, recognize that within Tembalani and the Housing Assembly, they talk about this as a class struggle. Right? But we also see that amongst other things, not only class struggle, it's actually also what we might think about back then as a classification struggle. Right? So it's both class and classification. See, the beauty about my generation growing up is that we never accepted the racial categories that was imposed on us, right? In other words, we always insisted on the idea that we belong to a broader humanity. Now, where this is a continuation of a long tradition that came out of predominantly the anti-colonial uprisings and insurgencies against a European project. So theorists, Fanon, we have some of the most, well, in my view, one of the most respected Fanonists, Lieutenant, thanks for joining us. But we begin to see there in his classical works where and I think the impulse that one recovers from there is a project, is a humanist sort of project. Now, this idea that the anti-colonial project was actually a negation of race. And I always tell people, I mean, philosophers, that we cut out to you with Stephen Biko, race was not, blackness was not for us a racial category. This is a flip around for people in the US. For us, blackness was an anti-racist category. It was a negation of race. Right? And I still think that's a very important idea to hold on, and I see that within the writings and speakings and songs within the poor people's movements in South Africa. Some of you were part of a language, or last night when the Housing Assembly was singing about my students were racialized. Right? Meaning that they never quite accepted these sorts of ideas. So this is the first, I think, one of the fundamental parts of what I think, especially the student movement, and right now, what they are beautifully recovering here is the project for decolonizing. So where does one begin to decolonize? There are many different ways to think about this, but I think from an Africanist perspective, one of the key insights of this is earlier writings of Biko and Ngugi wa Thiong'o, where we talk about decolonizing the mind. Meaning, at the essence of it, it's a language issue, right? And wa Thiong'o starts out with the idea that, and he uses this very useful metaphor about the Robinson Crusoe narrative, right? So colonization for him, I think quite importantly, as a linguistic project, was the ability to name things. Alright, so decolonization is actually the rejection of that naming of the world. In other words, what racial categories you belong to. So it's actually a linguistic, a discursive, and a cultural issue at the outset. So that's the first. So, so those are some of the currents that run through these negations. That is not broadly, it's broadly part of the anti-colonial, what we might call third world, Caribbean, and so forth. So for us, again, the philosophers that we grew up with, people like Stephen Biko, who of course was really Fanon, which is the idea that was the rejection of the apartheid racial categories of Indian, colored, and native. Right? So blackness was an anti-racist category. That's perhaps the first. So why does this all matter? And I think from the examples that we have, so when you see in Tembalani, they will sing about the class struggle, right? They are, and again, I think in their conceptualization and coupled with race, it's not about, if you want to, the sort of Hegelian antithesis of the bourgeoisie, meaning the proletariat, right? For them, there's a racialized component, right? Because again, from a European perspective, informal, unemployed workers might not be regarded as the proletariat. They may be categorized as the lumpen, right? They don't have any revolutionary potential. So I think that category of the mass unemployed, this is for them the rejection of those sorts of aspects. Michael and I think Tony has talked, I think at this point in time, that also in South Africa right now, all right, we have this sort of idea that racism is perhaps no longer part of a state project. In other words, there's no state categories of racialization. But, right, as Fernandez reminded us, the project of racialized categorization, right, is not just only a status, but it also has a cultural dimension. In other words, there's what some might call now a sort of commonsensical cultural aspect of racialized identity. So the earlier project was how are people within the working classes themselves dealing with the fact that they are no longer categorized in a particular way. Right? How are they finding each other? And I think the idea of people moving through a particular spatial terrains is quite key in just destabilizing that. So the material manifestations of the racialized project, starting with colonialism, of course, is now manifest in the urban landscape. Right? And the question is, to what extent does that shape, and to what extent can they contest those ideas of the racial categorization? So what I want to do, and again, what I'm trying to sort of argue is there are some very important projects in South Africa right now which are around the recovery of popular democratic, but this is the point I want to also suggest, anti-racist projects. And I want to say that perhaps which is the rejection of the category of race. All right, now, how does this link with perhaps competing projects? So the idea of a non-racial, liberal constitutional democracy is what is sort of governing South Africa at this point in time. But the idea of non-racialism, as it's thought about in South Africa right now, I want to suggest is a form of if you want to, categorization that links with the economy that some theorists in South Africa have talked about what we might call neoliberal forms of non-racialism. Right? So I'll just use this notion. Neoliberal non-racialism. And I'll just hold that and maybe let me put it in tension with an earlier popular democratic form of non-racialism, which we might call revolutionary non-racialism. Now, what's the distinction between the two? Right? So this is the state project in South Africa. Neoliberal non-racialism. It's a new form of liberal non-racialism, which, quite rightfully, starts with the idea with the rejection of race. Right? But what the state does, it goes on to argue then that because there's no races, it also means that there's no racists. In other words, it's a rejection both of the category of the race, but it's also the category of the historic, it's a rejection of the historical category of what Tembalani last night talked about, white settler colonial capitalism. So are there still settler colonial racists in South Africa? And I think the liberal state, in terms of the breach in South Africa right now, and the project for non-racial democracy is actually dealing with the difficulties in discursively denying, but materially the presence of a European colonial settler element in South Africa. But also the category that they were racists, right, who benefited from the material exploitation, in other words, the material economic exploitation. So this is manifest in many ways because, amongst other things, the black nationalists in South Africa right now are also reinventing the project because affirmative action is actually taking place based on the reinvention of the old categories. Right? In other words, for black economic empowerment, black understood in the apartheid category. So that's the paradox that the black national state is caught up in South Africa at this time. They're trying to get away from race, all right, but they need race in order to keep the constituency together. So that's one of the key fault lines that this is playing out, right? It's actually a very interesting and paradoxical question. Now, Where does one go and to, let's call this, versus revolution. Now, what do we mean by revolutionary non-racialism? That part of what I'm working to with other, recovering older versions, particularly Stephen Biko, Neville Alexander's ideology about the idea of the rejection of race, but more importantly also, right, the historical recognition, all right, that there were races who materially benefited, and there needs to be some form of redistribution and reparation. So it's both a negation of race, right, as a category, for the recovery of a common humanity, but it's also dealing and grappling with the idea that there has been a white settler colonial elite in South Africa, all right, that needs, and the project is around reparations, but how do you do reparations on a non-racial basis? Part of my thinking at the moment is we'll have to perhaps recover a more kind of spatial component to get around that. But I see within the Housing Assembly and other popular democratic movements, right, initiatives to recover a sort of non-revolutionary racism in two senses, in at least two senses. One, I think they themselves have negated these racialized categories, which of course is the state project, but they're also working more internationally, right? So I think the liberal, or I guess right now non-liberal, neoliberal racialism at this point in time is a nationalist project, right? It's a international, right? It's the same thing maybe in the European context as well. Once we start to see, I think, the revolutionary, then we begin to look at it as an international, in other words, a transnational project, because the European colonial project, of course, was not just about the class conflicts within the national state. It was a transnational project. In other words, the racial divide was always an imperialist aspect. In other words, the division was between non-European and European nations. There's a hierarchy there, which I think is the front line. And we start to see this on immigration struggles in South Africa, both in the continent, where they are working through relationships now with other, that's the term we still use, the rest of Africa, right? The other Africans, the national dependencies, and there are people here who have been working in the liberatory struggle in Mozambique. And so this project here is not a nationalist project, this is an anti-imperialist project. Right? It's a transnational project. And so these tensions, I want to suggest, is playing out, but the grounds that, the fertile ground where this is working through, I want to suggest, is not the state. Right? The black nationalist South African state right now is in a dead end. It's ideologically, politically corrupt. It's in a moribund state. And so we see the demise of the leadership, all right, the revolutionary project. There were moments back then under the Mandela state where there was a possibility opening for this type of, especially symbolically with the marriage to Russia itself, for example. All right, and recognizing the revolutionary indebtedness to the rest, if you want to put it that way, of the South African state. So just by way of summary, let me suggest the world historical project, starting out with European colonial, capitalist origins, okay, is fundamentally a racist project, right? Of Europeans versus non-Europeans. I think that is the millennial, half millennial genesis of it. So I think the European project is a racist project, right? Because it's the origin of colonialism from a African perspective. That's the big project. There have been important ruptures. I mean, I claim the world is a ghetto. Amongst other things, I mean, there are world historical theorists like Howie Minant, who actually uses that title to suggest that there's this tension between the official notion of white supremacy and again, the project which of white supremacy in the US is a national expression of a world phenomenon. Right? I mean, white supremacy is a world phenomenon. The US right now, perhaps, as Minant correctly points out, is, you call it the loss of innocence, right? And in Brazil, there are other formations. terms of racial democracy. In South Africa right now, we're going through our own version of maybe recovering ourselves outside of the official issue. So, in short, let me say, what I'm trying to do right now, and one of the courses I'm trying to work through, is to look at the anti-racist project as a world historical, but more importantly, a comparative project. And I think nationalist agendas don't quite cut it. They don't bring out the imperialist dimension. But where does one go and find that? I think there are popular and democratic movements that are anti-state, such as the Housing Assembly, where there are very important currents in collaboration with the student movement that is pointing to these sorts of connections. I'll leave it to that.